talk about the ultimate proof of creation. And I do believe there's an ultimate proof of creation. A lot of times when I do conferences, I'll present a lot of scientific evidence, and people will say, well, that's great, but I can't remember all that. I understand that. And so people have asked, is there one argument I could really focus in on, that I could know really well that'll blow away everything else? And the answer is, yes, there is. And that's what I want to share with you today. And really the next several sessions will just be fleshing out that argument. I'm going to give you an introduction to it in this first presentation, and then we'll go into a little more depth in the next two, because I want to give you a method of defending the faith that is irrefutable. And it's something I've been using for years, and it's awesome. It's very effective in terms of silencing the critics. Now, when you use this ultimate proof of creation on your unbelieving friends, and I would encourage you to do so, you may find that they don't all convert immediately. Some have never converted. But you see, I'm not giving you an ultimate persuasion. I'm giving you ultimate proof. I'm giving you a rational argument that has no refutation. It's absolutely conclusive. No one can refute it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people will be convinced by it, because the fact is, some people are just not willing to be convinced, even by a very good argument. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the argument. It means there's something wrong with people. People are not always rational. Good arguments don't always convince people. Bad arguments often do convince people. That's what logical fallacies are. They're bad arguments that people tend to find convincing. And you have to take classes to alleviate yourself of that sort of a foolish thinking. But in any case, here's the thing, though. It's not our job to persuade people. That's up to God, ultimately. Now, we want to be persuasive. We want to be winsome in the way that we present it. But nonetheless, you can't change somebody's heart any more than you can resurrect the dead. That's up to God. But I can give you an argument that they will not be able to answer. So keep that in mind. Just because somebody doesn't cry uncle doesn't mean I don't have them in a headlock. I've got them. They might not admit it, but I've got them. And this is a method. It's not a gimmick. It's not a trick. It's a method of revealing truth in a way that is inescapable. Some people would object to me calling it a method, but math is a method, and it's also true, right? So it's the same kind of thing. And there will be objections to this. Well, if it's a proof, is there any room for faith? Well, yes, of course. We're going to find that faith is essential for any proof. And we'll see how that works as we go along. But people have misconceptions of what faith is. Faith is when you have confidence in something you've not perceived with your senses. Hebrews 11:1. Right? That's faith. When you have confidence in something you have not perceived with your senses. Like God, I can't perceive God directly with my senses because He's a spirit and He's invisible normally. And yet I have confidence in Him because the Christian faith is objectively provable. And so this isn't just an argument for creation, it's an argument for the Christian worldview as a complete way of thinking. So don't think that this just applies to refuting evolution. It'll work on anything in terms of refuting anything that dares to challenge the wisdom of God. Now the particular examples I'm going to give are going to be more focused on evolution. That's kind of my specialty. But and I want to start with some arguments for creation that are good lines of evidence for creation, but they're less than ultimate. So that by contrast, you can see how the ultimate proof is different. Okay? And one of the lines of evidence we might use would be information theory. Dr. Bernard Gett, one of the world's experts on information theory, and a very fine Christian too. I've met him, and he's a great guy, but he's brilliant. And he studied information, how information is transmitted, and he finds that information always originates in the mind. You know that. You pick up a book that's got information in it. It starts, you know that somebody originally wrote the book. Now that book might be a copy of a copy of a copy. And the copying process need not be intelligent. Xerox machines can copy information, and they have no intelligence. But you need a mind to create the information. And so Dr. Gitt says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. That makes sense. We know that. The interesting thing, though, is DNA has information in it. The nucleotide base pairs on the rungs of the ladder in your DNA, this is the molecule that occurs in the cells of your body. It's got the instructions to make you, which is awesome. We think we're smart because we get all this information on a Blu-ray. God put the instructions to make you on a molecule. That's cool. And where did you get the instructions? Where did you get the information? You got it from your parents. They got it from their parents. Who got it from their parents. All the way back to Adam and Eve, who got it from God. That's consistent with the laws of information theory because it goes back to a mind, the mind of God. The process of copying that information, that's just a biochemical process. There doesn't, the enzymes are not intelligent. They're just doing what enzymes do. They've been designed to do that, of course, but you see it goes back to a mind. Now mutations, what about mutations though? Because that's where the secularists say all the information came from. But mutations don't actually add new information to the genome. Dr. Lisle, PhD in biophysics, Johns Hopkins University, says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. There's not even one mutation has been observed that adds little information to the genome. Interesting. Now, there are some mutations that in certain circumstances will actually help an organism survive. They'll generate a trait that, under specific circumstances, enhances survival, but still do it a loss of information. It's in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. See, it's consistent. Genetics, information science is consistent with creation. It's not consistent with evolutionary ideas, where that information spontaneously generates. That is not allowed according to the laws of information theory. Information theory says information always comes from the mind. It can't be generated spontaneously in matter. We can talk about the age of the Earth. I mentioned previously that C14 is a very strong indication that the Earth is nowhere near the millions or billions of years old, because C14 doesn't last millions of years. C14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. If the entire Earth, the entire mass of the Earth were nothing but C14, after 1 million years you'd not have one atom left. It would have all disintegrated, all turned into nitrogen. And yet we have C14. Now it is generated in the upper atmosphere, but we find it in rocks deep down in the Earth where it can't be generated. And that tells us that those rocks are nowhere near millions of years old, the fossils that we find buried in these deep rock layers, in diamonds even. So geology, physics, consistent with the biblical time scale, a recent creation, not millions of years ago. As I mentioned last night, comets. Comets are made of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun in an elliptical path. They spend most of their time far away from the sun, and they swing in and they get whiplashed back out. When they come close to the sun, you think, ice close to the sun, that can't be good. You'd be right. That sun heats up the ice, vaporizes it, causes the material to be blasted away from the comet. The dust and water vapor blasted away from the nucleus of the comet. And so every time you see a comet, it's getting smaller. Every time you see a comet, it's getting smaller. It's losing mass. And we know the amount of mass there. The nucleus of a comet typically is a few miles across. Not that much, really, in terms of most things in outer space that are a lot bigger than that. Now, the tail can extend millions of miles, but it's very thin. The source of the material, you just got a block of ice a few miles across. And every time it comes by the sun, it gets smaller, smaller, smaller. And we do the math. We know the rate at which the material is being depleted. We know the amount of material that's there. I can divine it, okay? Because I wasn't Common Core, math kind of thing. And so we estimate that a typical comet can last no more than about 100,000 years. And then it's gone. And I've seen comets that have been completely disintegrated in one pass, or sometimes it's less than that, much less than that. Comet Ison, which came by the sun a few years ago, around Christmas time. It's gone. There is no more Comet Ison. It's gone. Okay. It's been obliterated. So they can't last millions of years. Now, and I could go on and on. I have other presentations where I talk about the evidence for creation, evidence that's consistent with a young Earth, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with these lines of evidence that I presented, but they are not quite an ultimate proof. And the reason they're not an ultimate proof is that for every line of evidence that I presented, a secularist can always come up with what we might call a rescuing device. He can come up with a conjecture that will explain away this evidence, that will allow him to make sense of it in light of his worldview, his way of thinking. And so for comets, for example, secular astronomers have proposed that there's a vast reservoir of potential comets out beyond the farthest planets where the ice remains frozen, kind of circling out there in a big sphere, which they call an Oort cloud after the inventor, Jan Oort. And this cloud is said to supply new comets. So every now and then one of these potential comets is dislodged from this cloud and thrown into the inner solar system and becomes a brand new comet. So as the old comets are disintegrated, new ones replace them. So you see the solar system can be billions of years old after all. Clever. Now, if I were to ask a secular astronomer, do you have any observational evidence of an Oort cloud in our solar system? If he's honest, he'll say no. And if he's clever, he'll say that you can't prove it's not there. And that's true. I can't disprove the existence of an undetectable Oort cloud. It's undetectable. How am I supposed to disprove that? Right? Can't prove it or disprove it. That's what makes it such a good rescuing device. The best rescuing devices can't be proved or disproved. And so you're free to stipulate this conjecture that might very well be true, even though you don't have any evidence for it. But because there theoretically could be an Oort cloud, comets don't conclusively prove that the solar system's thousands of years old, right? Now, I don't believe there is an Oort cloud. There's no evidence for it. But secularists are welcome to propose that conjecture. And in fact, for every line of scientific evidence that I presented, if the person is sufficiently clever, he can come up with a rescuing device. I can say, what about the information in our DNA? Information never comes about by chance. Always goes back to a mind. It's consistent with creation. He could say, well, there could be some undiscovered process that produces information without a mind. We just haven't discovered it yet. Okay? Yeah, there's always a possibility of some undiscovered thing, right? That's the nature of science. Or I could say, what about the C14 in diamonds? He says, well, there's some way of regenerating the C14 down there deep in the earth. How? Well, we don't know. We haven't discovered it yet. Give us time, we'll find it. Right? Give us time, we'll find it. I call it the eschatological escape device, right? Because in the future, we'll have an explanation for this. And so, and by the way, before I'm too harsh with the critics, I have to point out that Christians, well, we have our rescuing devices too. If I were to point out two verses in Scripture that seem to contradict, I say, well, how do you reconcile this verse with that one? It seems to, and maybe it's something it's a section of Scripture you're not that familiar with. And you look at it and you're like, oh, yeah, on the surface that does look like a contradiction. You're probably not going to say, well, yeah, you got me there. I can't be a Christian anymore. Got to throw this away. You're probably going to say, I don't know what the answer is right now, but give me time, I'll find it. Right? Because I know this is the Word of God. I know it can't genuinely contradict itself. God doesn't deny Himself. So we have our rescue devices too. And the reason we have that is because we have a way of thinking about the world, a worldview, whereby we look at the world and we draw interpretations, not just based on what we see, but based on our way of thinking. And so my secular colleague, who's thinking in terms of billions of years, natural forces producing everything, he looks at the world, he sees comets, and he concludes there must be an Oort cloud. Now I'm starting with biblical history. I know the world's young because what the Bible teaches. I look at comets and I say, yeah, the solar system's young. I don't need an Oort cloud. We draw different interpretations of the very same evidence because we have a different foundational way of thinking. A lot of people think the way you win the origins debate is you get more facts on your side. But I got news for you. Creationists and evolutionists have the same facts. You realize that? I look at the same stars and galaxies as my secular colleagues. I have access to the same fossils and the same genetic patterns and so on. We have the same facts. In terms of the way we do science pretty much the same way. In terms of observational, testable, repeatable science in the present, we do it the same way. When I do stoichiometry, I do it the same way as my secular colleagues. I use the same math they use, right? We do science the same way. But when it comes to origins, we draw different conclusions. Why? Not because of the evidence, but because we have a different way of thinking about the evidence, a different worldview, which you can think of like mental glasses. Now, only some of us wear glasses physically, but we all have mental glasses because we all have a way of thinking about things. And that will affect the conclusions that we draw from the evidence that we see. Just like, and I like to think of the Bible like corrective lenses that are designed just for you. They're prescription lenses. You put those on, the world snaps into focus. You see things as they really are. I like to think of evolution like red glasses. Now, you put on red glasses, you'll go out and say, wow, the world is red. Well, it's not really red, is it? But that's what you see, because those are the glasses you're wearing. And I realize the evolutionists will say, no, we're wearing the right glasses, you're wearing the red glasses, and we'll have to debate that. But my point is we all have mental glasses because we all have a worldview. We all have presuppositions. Presuppositions are your most basic beliefs about reality. They're not just any old assumption. They're an assumption you hold to very tightly. An assumption that you hold to before you even begin to investigate the evidence. And yes, we all have them. We all have presuppositions. The basic reliability of your senses. How do you know that your senses are basically reliable? That's a presupposition. You assume that before you go out and do your science. You say that, well, there's this rock on the road. I'm going to be objective. I'm not going to make any assumptions. I'm going to do some experiments on this rock. Actually, you've already assumed that the rock is there because you see it. You've assumed your senses are reliable. that you're not just a brain in a jar and all your experiences are just electrical impulses. How do you know that? It's a presupposition. How do you justify these presuppositions? Well, we'll talk about that. The basic reliability of your memory. Presumably, you assume that the memories you actually have actually happened, right? Say, I remember doing that, so it must have really happened. How do you know that? How do you know that your memory is basically reliable? You might say, well, Dr. Lisle, I took a test 2 weeks ago. I got an A on it. It was a memory test, so I know my memory is reliable. Then I'm going to ask, how do you know you took a memory test 2 weeks ago? Well, I remember taking it. Oh, yeah. You have to assume that your memory is reliable in order to argue that you correctly remember that your memory is reliable. That's the nature of a presupposition. Can't escape that. Laws of logic are presuppositions, right? Even if you can't recite one, you all know laws of logic. The law of non-contradiction says you can't have A and not A at the same time in the same sense. If I said my car's in the parking lot and it's not in the parking lot, you wouldn't rush out to see that. I'm not going to see a car that's there and not there. No, you know that's wrong. That's a presupposition. Can you prove that there are laws of logic? That they exist? I think you can, but not without using them. Right? Because you use logic to prove anything. So that's the nature of a presupposition. They're inescapable. And again, some people might say, not me. I don't have these presuppositions. I don't have beliefs about how evidence should be interpreted. I'm objective. I believe that you ought to interpret the evidence objectively, neutrally. In which case I'm going to say, that's a very interesting belief about how evidence should be interpreted. The philosophy that we should come to the evidence with no philosophy is itself a philosophy. It's just a very bad one because it's self-repeating. So that's the nature of presuppositions. And all your presuppositions together form your worldview. The worldview is a network of presuppositions untested by the natural sciences and in light of which all of our experiences are interpreted. Now the kicker is creationists and evolutionists have competing worldviews. We have different sets of presuppositions. And therefore we can look at exactly the same evidence and draw very different interpretations about what it means. Because our founding assumptions are different. Our view of reality differs. And you're going to find, too, that presuppositions are hierarchical. Some of them are more basic than others. I might be willing to give up one of my presuppositions to protect a more foundational one, for example. And we'll see how that works out a little bit later. But you're going to find that your presuppositions go back to an ultimate standard, one that is basic, more basic than all the others. And for the creationist, the Bible is the ultimate standard, at least it should be. I'm not saying all creationists have the Bible as their ultimate standard. I'm just saying they should. I mean, if this really is the authoritative Word of God, He doesn't lie, He knows everything, wouldn't it make sense to start with this, base our thinking on this? It would be foolish not to, if it really is the Word of God, and it claims to be, and it demonstrates that it is for reasons that we'll see later. So the Bible should be our ultimate standard. Now, I have secondary standards, right? I believe in God. My senses are basically reliable. But that's not my primary standard because I know my senses can be fooled. Have you ever seen an optical illusion? Yeah. Have you ever seen wood, imagine a beam of wood being put in water at an angle, and you know how it looks like it bends when it goes into the water because of the way the light refracts, right? So now I've got my eyes telling me that wood bends. Do I believe that? No. For one thing, I could put my hand in there, I could say, well, it still feels straight. Now what do? I got one sense telling me it bends, I got another sense telling me it doesn't bend. Well, I've got a presupposition that tells me how to deal with that. It tells me that in this case, my eyes aren't to be trusted because I understand something about the principles of refraction and so on. But my point is the Bible is my ultimate standard because I'm not going to give that up no matter what. And that bothers a lot of critics, but they have their ultimate standard too, you see. So we're going to have to defend that. For the evolutionist, usually the ultimate standard is either naturalism or strict empiricism. There are different evolutionists out there, so this isn't always the case, but almost always the case. It's either naturalism or strict empiricism. Naturalism is the belief that nature's all there is. Everything that exists is matter in motion, and therefore you can't invoke the supernatural. So a strict naturalist would not believe in miracles, at least not miracles that violate natural law. Or strict empiricism. Strict empiricist has the theory that all truth claims are answered by observation. And so if you want to know something, you need to observe it with your senses. You need to taste it, touch it, feel it, whatever. And if you can't observe it with your senses, you shouldn't believe it. Now, I do believe that some truth claims can be answered empirically. If I want to know whether or not there are crackers in my cupboard, I can go and I can answer that empirically. I get that. But I don't believe all truth claims are answered that way. Life after death couldn't be answered that way, right? So here's the problem. Here's the rub. Most people use what's sometimes called evidential arguments. And there's a place for evidence in apologetics. And as a scientist, I like evidence. I tend to use a lot of it. But you need to understand that evidence by itself is never decisive when it comes to a worldview issue. Okay, so if we're debating worldviews, remember a worldview is how you look at the evidence. And when the discussion is how you look at the evidence, you can't just use evidence to say, you have to look at it this way. And I have a silly example I like to use to illustrate this. There was a man who thought that he himself was dead. He was convinced that he himself was dead. And I've been using this analogy for a long time. I found out it's actually a real condition. There are actually some people who think that they're dead. And anyway, this man is very upset about this. He doesn't like being dead. And his doctor is trying to convince him, well, of course you're not dead. You're walking and talking. And the guy thinks about it and says, yeah, but bodies can have muscle spasms even after clinical death. That could explain my ability to walk and talk. And the doctor says, but look, I just did a medical workup on you. You're perfectly healthy. Here's your pulse and so on. He says, yeah, but that, first of all, you might not be interpreting the data right. And secondly, that might not even be my chart. Maybe the names got swapped, right? That could be somebody else's chart. The doctor, getting very frustrated, says, okay, I'm going to prove to you that you are not dead. Do dead men bleed? The guy thinks about it. The circulatory system would be stopped. No, dead men don't bleed. And the doctor very quickly takes a little pin, puts the guy in the hand, sure enough, a little blood comes to the surface. See, you're bleeding. To which the man responds, well, how about that? I guess dead men do bleed. Silly example, I know, but did the doctor have good evidence for his position? Sure, yeah, the guy could walk and talk. In medical charts, the guy could bleed. There's nothing wrong with those lines of evidence. Those are good lines of evidence that the guy's alive. Did they persuade him? No. Because in each case, he was able to come up with a rescuing device to explain that evidence in light of his presupposition that he himself was dead. And so you see, just throwing at evidence at people will not cause them to consistently change their presupposition. Oh, you might get lucky once in a while, but for the most part, it won't. If you're up against somebody who is committed to his worldview and is clever, he'll always come up with a rescuing device. And so it's not wrong to show people evidence. You can point out, hey, fossils are great evidence of the worldwide flood. And they are. But then again, I'm looking at it correctly through the history recorded in Scripture. And so when I look at that fossil, I think, yeah, worldwide flood, of course. It's going to kill organisms, bury them in sediment, and the minerals will move through and fossilize and so on. Of course, fossils are great evidence for the worldwide flood. But you see, my secular colleague, because he's not looking at it with the same worldview that I am, he's got his different presuppositions. He's going to say, that's not how I see it. Here's how I think this fossil formed. He's thinking in terms of millions of years, slow, gradual processes, lots of local floods, gradually depositing fossils and so on. And the funny thing is, we're inclined to think, well, yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. You can. I don't think that's the right way, but nonetheless, we think, well, yeah, that evidence didn't persuade him. What we need then is more evidence, right? And so we say, look, how canyons can form very quickly. They don't require millions of years. The Mount St. Helens eruption proved that, cut a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours. He says, well, yeah, but just because that canyon formed quickly doesn't mean the Grand Canyon formed quickly. We know that took millions of years. And you're like, well, yeah, I guess one example doesn't prove all of them, does it? So we need more evidence. Look, sedimentation can be deposited very quickly. Rock layers can be formed quickly. Mount St. Helens demonstrated that. Deposited all kinds of sediment, some of which is hardened into rock. He says, well, yeah, just because those layers were quickly doesn't mean these ones were. These ones we think took millions of years. You say, but look, animals, they reproduce according to their kind, just the way the Bible says. Kangaroos beget kangaroos. He says, well, sure, today, but given enough time, one kind can eventually become another. We just haven't been around long enough to see it. You say, oh, but look, there's information in DNA. Information never comes about by chance. He says, well, there could be some undiscovered process that produces that information. Just give us time. We'll find it. Science is a process, after all. Oh, but look, in outer space, we've got things like comets. Comets can't last billions of years. He says, well, no problem. There's more cloud that makes new ones. You see where I'm going with this? Every line of evidence you present, if you're up against somebody who's clever and who's consistently thinking in terms of his worldview, he'll come up with the rest of your guys. Now, I say this, and people think, well, Lisle, are you saying we shouldn't use evidence? That's not what I'm saying. In fact, I think we should do some of this. Why? Because in our culture, we've been so inundated with evolution in millions of years that many people don't realize there is a Christian way to look at the evidence. And I think it's helpful to show them, hey, look, I can make sense of comments without the need for an word cloud in my worldview because they're just young, you see. And I think we should do some of this. I think we should show people evidence and how the Bible makes sense of it. But my point is, if you think that's going to win the debate, that by itself is not consistently. It's good to show people evidence, don't get me wrong, and how the Bible makes sense of it. Please do that. It's good. And again, some people are more inclined toward science than others. That's fine. God gave us all different strengths so we can help each other. If you say, I like biology, great, study biology, learn some of the arguments there. But my point is, it's not decisive. It's not going to resolve the debate, because the debate is a debate of worldviews. It's a debate of worldviews, not evidence. A person's worldview will tell them how to interpret the evidence. And so you can't just throw evidence at people and expect them to change their worldview, because their worldview is going to say, okay, here's how I interpret that evidence, here's how I interpret that evidence, and so on. And I think the reason why, I mean, if this is sort of a new way of thinking for you, I think it's because we tend to spend most of our time with people that have basically the same worldview that we have. And if two people have the same worldview, you can convince them by evidence. If you and I have a disagreement about whether or not there are crackers in the cupboard, we can settle that by opening up the cupboard, say there are crackers there, I was right, and we should come to agreement. Because we have the same worldview, we interpret the same evidence the same way. But if I'm debating against somebody who's a Hindu, who believes that this world is all illusion, it's all Maya, and I say, see, there's the crackers, is that going to convince him? No, he's going to say, well, that's illusion too. You see, if you have a different worldview, you can't just throw evidence at people and expect them to switch their opinion on the issue. Because we need to understand that people have a different way of looking at the very same evidence. So how do we proceed then? I'm standing over here on my biblical presuppositions. My secular colleague is standing on his secular presuppositions. How do we get anywhere? You see, the goal really is to show that my presuppositions are the right presuppositions with which to interpret the evidence. We can't just throw evidence back and forth, because we'll each interpret that evidence according to our own worldview. And if there's some evidence that would appear contrary to our worldview, no problem, that's what rescuing devices are for. We can come up with an explanation for that. And because they're untestable, it's very difficult to disprove the rescuing device. So how do we win? Well, before I give you the right answer, I want to give you the wrong answer. Because a lot of people, usually the critic comes up with this idea, and he'll say, I've got an idea how we can resolve this debate. We'll meet on neutral grounds. Because surely there are some presuppositions that we agree on, like, for example, the scientific method. You agree with the scientific method? Well, yeah, I do. For certain kinds of truth claims, yes. So see, that's a neutral presupposition. We'll meet on neutral ground, and we'll leave out of the discussion all the things we don't agree on. And he says, and I certainly don't agree the Bible's the Word of God, so you got to leave that out of the discussion. And that sounds very reasonable to a lot of Christians, and they fall for that. But it's a trap. It's a trap. Why? Well, what does the Bible have to say about neutral ground? There's no such thing as neutral ground. Jesus says, he who is not with me is, what, neutral? No, he's against me. He who does not gather with me scatters. Interesting. There's no neutral when it comes to an ultimate faith commitment. You can't be neutral. You're either for Christ or you're against him. Christ himself says that. Romans 8:7, the mindset on the flesh is, what, neutral toward God? Oh no, it's hostile toward God. That's interesting. It does not subject itself to the law of God. It's not even able to do so. You would also say, do you not know that friendship with the world is, what, neutrality to God? Hostility toward God. Interesting. That's interesting. You see, a lot of times, people who profess to be atheists will say, I'm very neutral and very objective. I just haven't been persuaded. I haven't seen enough evidence that God exists. But when I'm neutral, I'd be willing to believe in God. The Bible says that's not the case. The Bible says you are antagonistic toward God right now. You're in a state of rebellion against him. We'll see that as we go on. So, since the Bible indicates that there is no neutral when it comes to an ultimate faith commitment, the claim that there is itself unbiblical. Does that make sense? See, if somebody, the Bible says there's no neutral. So if you come along and say, well, yes, there is neutral, and I'm neutral, well, you've just said the Bible's wrong, in which case, you're not being neutral. You've taken a stand. You've taken an anti-biblical stand. And so we're going to call the attempt to be neutral the pretended neutrality fallacy. My mentor on this topic, Dr. Bronson, liked to call it that. I think that's a good name for it. The attempt to be neutral is a fallacy. Because you see, by saying there is neutral, you've said the Bible's wrong. And that is not a neutral position, is it? And make sure you understand that, because you will have to explain that to somebody at some point. Because most unbelievers think they're neutral, objective. And you're going to have to point out, by believing that you're neutral and objective, you've said the Bible's wrong. In which case, you're not being neutral and objective. So don't fall for that trap. If somebody says, well, there's neutral ground that we can meet on. And you got to leave the Bible out of the discussion, because that's not one of the things we agree on. And you say, oh, sure, yeah, we can leave the Bible out of the discussion, because there's neutral ground. Wait a minute, the Bible says there's no neutral ground. Neutral ground is a secular concept. It's anti-biblical. And if you agree to those terms, you've pretty well lost the debate. Because the debate really, isn't the debate really about whether or not this is true? Mm-hmm. That's really what it's about. Because if it's true, it's creation, you got it. And you've started the debate by saying this is not true, at least about neutrality. You're not going to win a debate by immediately conceding defeat in the first step. You can't defend biblical authority by immediately abandoning biblical authority. Secularists like to think they're very neutral, and they're going to want you to be neutral. Two things to remember when people ask you to be neutral. One, they're not. Two, you shouldn't be. Okay? No one is neutral when it comes to an ultimate standard, an ultimate faith commitment, and you're not supposed to be. Now, I'll grant, because people think, well, science needs to be objective, and I'll grant that we need to be as objective as possible, but you can't be totally neutral. You can't be, because science itself actually presupposes the Christian worldview. We'll get to that a little bit later. But you can't be neutral. We have presuppositions, and we're going to have to examine those. We're going to have to debate those presuppositions. Yes, we do stand on God's word while we defend it. The man of God is to hold fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that they will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. We do stand on God's word even when we're refuting someone who contradicts God's word. He says, but I don't believe in God's word. Well, that's your problem. You should. So don't quote scripture to me. Well, that's your problem if you don't believe it. It's still true, right? You're going to need to put gas in your car even if you say, well, I don't believe in gasoline. Right? Well, you're not going to get very far. As soon as your first tank runs out, you're done. Well, how do we get anywhere? The thing to remember is that presuppositions, we all have them. All of us have them. But the thing that I find interesting is most people are not aware of their own presuppositions. Especially critics, but sadly Christians too. I think we all need to spend some time thinking about these things. Presuppositions are a bit like your kidneys. You can't survive without them. They're constantly doing what they're doing. They're constantly functioning. And yet most people are not aware of their own. Ever thought about that? You probably didn't think about your kidneys today until I mentioned it. Most people are not aware of their own until something goes wrong with one of them. If you ever had a kidney stone, you were suddenly very aware of your kidneys. I've had one. They're not pleasant. Presuppositions are the same way. They're constantly processing our worldview. The way that I'm going to show that my presuppositions are correct, what I'm going to do is basically give the unbeliever the intellectual equivalent of a kidney stone. I'm going to give him something that his presuppositions cannot process. And he's going to suddenly be aware of his presuppositions, probably for the first time in his life. Interesting. You see, the thing about biblical presuppositions, and this is the ultimate proof. Biblical presuppositions make it possible for us to know things, to have knowledge, to do science, to reason, and so on. If secular presuppositions were true, none of those things would be possible. None of them would be justified. And I'm going to flesh that out as we go on. Because you see, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So this is my argument. We know some things, right? You know some things about the universe. You know that you live on Earth and that it's round, and you know that the stars are bright, and so on. You know some things. And the only reason you're able to know some things is because God, who is the God of truth, has revealed himself to you in a number of ways. But if the Bible were not true, you couldn't know anything. You could believe some things, but you could never know them. You could never know if they're true. You could never be certain of anything. And we'll see how that works out. But you can see biblically the reason for it is because knowledge comes from God, ultimately. So if there's no God, there's no knowledge. In Christ, we're getting all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. If you're going to know anything, it's because the Bible is true. Now, some people object to this because they think, well, wait a minute, Dr. Lisle, I know some non-Christians, and they do know some things. And that's true. But I didn't say you had to profess a belief in God to know things. I just said the Bible has to be true. Is the Bible true for unbelievers? Yeah. They don't admit it, but it's still true. And so they can have knowledge. And the amazing thing is, they do know God. Unbelievers do know God. So some people say, well, wait a minute, you're telling me we need to know God to know things? Yes. Unbelievers do know God, and therefore they know some things. The Bible says that God has revealed himself to everyone. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who, what, who just don't know any better? No, who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. That's interesting. Well, I could do a whole presentation just on that, because if you think about it, the person who knows the truth, see, to suppress the truth and unrighteousness, you first have to know the truth to suppress it. And so unbelievers know God, they don't want to know God, and so they suppress that truth and unrighteousness. It's self-deception. The Bible mentions it again in James chapter 1. Self-deception, it's a fascinating psychological phenomenon. To be self-deceived, you have to, on the one hand, know the truth so that you can do the deceiving, and then you have to somehow accept your deception. It's quite fascinating. But in any case, the Bible has a lot to say about the topic. But we're motivated because of our sin. We're rebels against God. We're motivated to not believe in God. That's why unbelievers suppress the truth and unrighteousness. They do not like a God who is rightly angry at them for their sin. And so they say, oh, well, I don't believe in that God. Well, they do in their heart of hearts. They have to. They can't escape it. God's made himself known, right? Verse 19. Because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. God has hardwired us to know that he exists. And by the way, if you believe these verses, and you should, it will affect the way you do apologetics. Do I have to show people all kinds of new evidence that God exists? No, because they already know that God exists. All I have to do is try and expose their suppressed knowledge of God. They don't want to believe in God, and I'm pointing that out to them. I'm going to say, no. Somebody says, well, I'm an atheist. I say, no, you're not. God says you're not. I don't believe in God. Yes, you do. And you exhibit that by the way you behave, and we'll see how that works out. But it's just you don't want to believe in God. Because you want to behave in a way that's contrary to his law. You don't like the God of the Bible. You hate God. And you can't hate what you don't believe in. Romans 1:20, which says, the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Why? Because God has shown it to them. God's hardwired us to look out in the universe and say, this is the creation of God. Creation is obvious. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The way that's worded in the Greek, without excuse, and apologia, without an apologetic. Isn't that interesting? The way I do apologetics is by realizing that unbelievers have no apologetic. The only people who can rationally defend their faith are Christians. And if you realize that, you realize you can make other people defend their faith, right? You can politely challenge them and say, well, how do you account for this? How do you make sense of that? And if they're not a Christian, they ultimately won't be able to make sense of their own worldview, because their presuppositions will self-destruct. So you see, my argument for the Bible is that only the Bible can make sense of those things that are necessary for knowledge. And again, I'm going to go through this because I know it's, if you're new to this way of thinking, it's you're like, does that really work out? Can we really know things apart from God? No, you can't. If the Bible were not true, you couldn't know anything. And we'll see why that is as we go on. You can think of it this way. The Bible contains what we might call prerequisites for knowledge. the universe would have, in order for knowledge to be possible, the universe would have to be a certain way. There would have to be certain prerequisites. You know what prerequisites are, right? In college, you have to take Calculus 1 before you take Calculus 2. Otherwise, Calculus 2 won't make any sense, right? Some of you are thinking it didn't make sense anyway. But my point is, Calculus 1 is a prerequisite. It's foundational, and then Calculus 2 builds on it. In order for us to have knowledge, the universe would have to be a certain way. We might call those prerequisites for knowledge. For example, the universe would have to be sort of orderly, wouldn't it? If the universe were really just completely random, where literally anything could happen from one second to the next, you couldn't really know anything, could you? There'd be no patterns in nature to study. So you might call that a prerequisite for knowledge, or laws of logic by which we reason. In order for us to use laws of logic would have to exist. That's a prerequisite for knowledge. So those are some examples of prerequisites for knowledge that I would argue are only sensible in the Christian worldview. Only the Bible can justify, make sense of, provide us with a good reason for believing in these prerequisites of knowledge. And therefore, if the Bible were not true, you couldn't prove anything is true. That's a different kind of an argument, and I dare say it is irrefutable. What are some things that are necessary for knowledge that stem from the biblical worldview? I'm just going to list 3 today. Laws of logic, uniformity of nature, absolute morality. Laws of logic. Laws of logic are the rules of correct reasoning. Why would there be rules of correct reasoning? Well, in the Christian universe, I can make sense of that. We have a standard for correct reasoning. That standard is God, as revealed to us in His Word. God's mind is the source of all truth, and so if you want to think truthfully, you need to think in a way that is consistent with the nature of God. That's what laws of logic are. They're descriptions of the way God thinks, and therefore the way we must think if we're to think truthfully. Okay, so laws of logic make sense in a Christian worldview. Do they make sense in a chance universe? Why would there be laws if there's no lawgiver? That's what I want to know. Who decides what are the correct rules of reasoning if it's all just different opinions, right? Interesting. Why would you have laws of logic in a chance universe? It doesn't make sense. It's based on the Christian worldview. We'll go into more details on that later. Uniformity of nature, not to be confused with uniformitarianism. I don't believe race and conditions are constant, but I do believe there's orderliness in nature because God has imposed order on nature. The universe is upheld by the mind of God, and as such, the universe is rational. It can be understood by our minds because we're made in the image of God. And so there's a correspondence between our mind and the universe. They're both creations of God. They're meant to go together. And so I can do science because I expect to find patterns in nature because God has imposed patterns on nature. Makes sense. But in a chance universe, why would there be patterns in nature? Right? Everybody assumes that there are. And that's what makes science possible. But how would that be the case in a chance universe? It doesn't make sense, does it? Science really is predicated on a Christian worldview. We'll come back to that again later as well. But what I want to focus in on in this presentation is morality, because those 2, laws of logic, uniformity of nature, are kind of abstract. Most people haven't thought about what makes science possible or why laws of logic exist. Most people haven't thought about those, but people have given thought to morality. And people have very staunch opinions on morality. Just bring up abortion, and people will say, okay, here's my opinion on what's right and what's wrong. But you see, my point is, right and wrong only makes sense in the Christian universe. Right is that which corresponds to God's approval, that what God approves of. Wrong is that what He disapproves of. And it's absolute because God is sovereign over the entire universe. And so right and wrong are the same everywhere. They're the same for all people because we're all made in the image of God. God's given us all the same standard to obey. Right? So I can have absolute morality. It makes sense in the Christian worldview. But does morality make sense in an atheistic universe? What does right and wrong even mean in an atheistic universe? In an atheistic universe, what happens simply happens. There's no right or wrong about it. It's just chemistry. Chemicals do what chemicals do. There's no right or wrong about it. Absolute morality presupposes that we can consider various options and then choose the right one. Chemistry, however, has no choice. Chemistry does what chemistry does. And so if we're just a chemical accident, you don't have choice. The atheistic worldview would make nonsense of the idea of morality. And you might be thinking, what about other religions? Well, they have their problems too. First of all, we can immediately eliminate any polytheistic religion, because which God's standards would you follow? Oh, yeah. Can't have absolute morality if the Greek religion, the ancient Greeks were right. Because somebody says, well, I'm going to follow Zeus's morality. Somebody says, well, I'm going to follow Herod's. Who's right? Well, they're just different, You can't have absolute morality in polytheistic religion. So that kind of narrows it down to 3, right? Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. And Islam, well, we can talk about that in more detail later in any other presentations. But it's going to have its problems too. It's because God is our creator that he has the right to make the rules. And so it's based on creation. Now, my point is not that unbelievers don't accept laws of logic and uniformity of nature and absolute morality. My point is they do. And yet, on their professed worldview, there should be no foundation for those things. And so when the atheist says, but Lisle, I believe in laws of logic, I'm going to say, well, you shouldn't, because you're an atheist, right? How do you have laws with no lawgiver? That doesn't make any sense. Why should you follow them? But I can do science. Well, yeah, but that's because the Bible's true. You see, on your worldview, you can't explain why there's patterns in nature to be discovered. You can't justify your assumption that they apply everywhere at all times and so on. So, but I'm basically a good person. I say, well, first of all, you're not. But secondly, the fact that you have a sense of morality shows that you know God in your heart of hearts. Because in a chance universe, there's no such thing as morality.
Right.
That doesn't even make any sense. So, and again, we're going to focus in kind of on morality for this first presentation, and we'll do the other ones a little bit later on, because I think morality is the easiest to start with. My point is that you have these two competing worldviews, and most people think it's just a question of personal choice. I have this is my religion. Okay, I like blue. Somebody else says, I like flame color. But what you're going to find is when you examine these worldviews carefully, the biblical worldview works. It can lead to knowledge. It makes sense. When we open it up, it can go somewhere. It can lead to knowledge. The secular worldview, when we examine it carefully, it can't possibly go anywhere. It can't lead to knowledge. Okay? It's futile. It's empty. That's the way the Bible talks about it. And the way that you can refute non-biblical worldviews is with an internal critique. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about internal critiques, but I want to give you kind of an introduction here. An internal critique is where you temporarily stand on the wrong worldview to show that it self-destructs, to show that it's inconsistent with itself. So, for example, let's take relativism. You've probably met relativists. They say, all things are relative. There are no absolutes. Right? And, of course, when they say there are no absolutes, the question you want to ask is, are you absolutely certain? How do they answer that? It doesn't matter how they answer that. You're lost at that point. Because the statement there are no absolutes is an absolute statement. If it's true, it's false, therefore it's false. Easy. Relativism refutes itself on its own terms. Strict empiricism. A lot of evolutionists are strict empiricists. They believe that all truth claims are proved by empirical observation. You want to know something? You better observe it with your senses. You better see it, taste it, touch it, whatever. Okay? And if you can't see it, if you can't prove it empirically, you shouldn't believe it. Here's the problem with that. How do you know the statement itself is true? Did you prove it by empirical observation? Think about that. See, the statement, all truth claims are proved by empirical observation, is itself a truth claim, isn't it? It's a truth claim that cannot be proved by empirical observation. Because you can't observe a truth claim. And you certainly can't, even if you could, you can't observe all of them because there's an infinite number of them. So you see, the statement itself, if it were true, should not be believed. Isn't that interesting? It refutes itself on its own terms. Strict empiricism is self-refuting. All non-Christian worldviews are self-refuting. You just have to push the unbeliever to be consistent with what he says he believes, and it'll come back and self-destruct every time. Every time. So here's the way you proceed then. I'm standing on my biblical presuppositions. Bible's true. There are absolutes from God. There are laws of logic. There are laws of morality, uniformity, and induction in nature which makes science possible. My secular colleague is standing on some combination of secular presuppositions, naturalism, strict empiricism, relativism, neutrality. The Bible's irrelevant to science. Here's the thing to remember. Those presuppositions can't support a worldview because they're self-destructing. They won't make knowledge possible. They're sinking sand. That's the way the Bible puts it. They're sinking sand. And when that sand dissolves away, the unbeliever's left in a rather peculiar position. Unbelievers cannot stand on their own professed worldview because it won't make knowledge possible. And they do believe knowledge is possible, right? So what's he going to do? He's going to do this. Unbelievers will stand on Christian presuppositions because they have to. They have to. If they're going to survive in God's universe, they're going to have to play by God's rules. They're going to have to accept laws of logic. They're going to have to accept uniformity of nature. They're going to have to accept morality. They may not obey it, but the concept at least has to exist. So it's interesting because I pointed out previously there's no neutral ground between the believer and the unbeliever, but there is common ground. It's just not neutral. It's God's ground. Unbelievers have to stand on God's ground. They have to. And they do that because they're made in the image of God. They do know God in their heart of hearts. And so they borrow Christian presuppositions because they have to. Unbelievers are constantly stealing from the Christian worldview to try and support their own. You might think of unbelievers as presuppositional kleptomaniacs. They're constantly stealing from the Christian worldview. They can't help themselves. And he's able to do it because he does have a type of faith in God. It's not saving faith. But he knows that God exists. He believes in God, and therefore he knows that there are absolutes in nature. He knows that the universe far away is the same as nearby because God is omnipresent and so on. And he uses these things to get along in the world, and yet he denies the God that makes it possible. He's inconsistent. And so what we're going to do is point out that inconsistency. We're going to say, look, fellow, you're standing on God's ground. They'll say, no, it's not. No, these are laws of logic. Those are secular presuppositions. But then I'm going to challenge them. I'm going to say, well, how do you make sense of these abstract laws of reasoning, and how do they come about? And he's not going to be able to answer that. So, but I believe in morality. Yes, but you shouldn't. You claim to be an atheist. There's no morality in an atheistic universe. There's no should in a universe that's just chemistry, right? He's standing on Christian ground, denying that he's standing on Christian ground, stealing Christian principles to support his own worldview, and we're pointing out the inconsistency. We're going to say, look, fella, you are standing on God's ground. You either need to get saved or stop trespassing. Okay? You're pretty able to say, that's between you and God. You can think of a debate over biblical authority or origins a lot like a debate on the existence of air. Can you imagine two people arguing about whether or not air exists? What would the critic of air say? He's up there making all these elaborate arguments. Oh, there's no such thing as air. All the while breathing air and expecting that we could hear his arguments as the sound is transmitted through the air. Wouldn't that be strange? You see, the critic of air has to use air in order to make a case against air. The fact that he's able to make an argument at all proves that his argument is wrong. And if you understand that, it's the same way with creation and any biblical doctrine. The critic of the Bible has to use biblical presuppositions in order to argue against the Bible. The fact that he's able to make an argument proves that his argument is wrong. Think about it. Any argument against the Bible will be along the lines of, well, the Bible is illogical, it contradicts itself, in which case they're borrowing God's laws of logic to make the argument. Or they'll say, well, the Bible's not scientific, in which case they're borrowing the fact that the universe is uniform because God upholds it in a consistent way, as the Bible teaches. They're borrowing that biblical principle. Or they'll say the Bible is morally disgusting. It does, God does things that I don't approve of, in which case they're borrowing absolute morality, which only makes sense in the Christian universe. Isn't that interesting? Every argument against the Bible must presuppose the truth of the Bible in order to get off the ground. And if you recognize that, well, that's powerful. You have the critic there, standing on Christian ground, denying it, and then using Christian principles to argue against Christianity. And that's not going to work out well for him. Because you see, even if he were successful in refuting the Christian worldview, he would lose the ground on which he must stand to make the argument. Isn't that fascinating? That's the nature of knowledge, though. You want to argue against God, you're going to lose. We were thinking of ways to illustrate this. I kept thinking of those old Wile E. Coyote cartoons where he would create a trap where he would get caught up in himself. And that really is the way, that's the way the Bible says that it is. God catches the wise in their own craftiness. I mean, it's fascinating. We don't realize often how utterly dependent we are on God for everything. And unbelievers, they're dependent on God. They have to use His presuppositions. They have to use His laws of logic. The fact that He upholds the universe in a consistent way. They have to assume that to get up in the morning. But they're not grateful. They're not thankful to God. And they become self-deluded. And again, these are some of the principles I like to kind of specialize in. I'm not suggesting these are the only three. I think there are other principles you could use. the fact that human beings have dignity and respect because we're made in the image of God. Even an atheist will go to the funeral of his friend. But why would he if that person's just a bag of chemicals? Right? Well, no, that person has dignity. Yes, he does, because he's made in the image of God. That's a Christian principle. Or the rationality, human rationality. We can make logical decisions because we're made in the image of God. And God is perfectly logical. And being made in his image, we have the capacity to be logical, but we aren't always because of our sin nature and so on. But I want to specialize again on morality. I want to kind of zoom in on that one for this presentation, because I think that's the easiest to start with. If this is new, a new way of thinking, start with morality, because we've thought about that a little bit. We've thought about right and wrong. And if you think about it, right and wrong makes sense in a creation worldview, where God made us and he has the right to make the rules. We're created in his image. God's communicated to us. He's created laws from the very beginning, and he holds us accountable to whether or not we have obeyed his law. But if God didn't create us, why would there be an absolute moral code? If Adam's in your past, God owns you. He's got the right to make the rules. You're accountable to God. If Abe is in your past, do what you want. You own yourself. Now, some people might say, that's right. Morality is relative. Because I'm a consistent evolutionist, and I believe that I've evolved, and so have you, so I can have my own moral code, and so can you. I say, really? Then can you give me a reason why I shouldn't pull out my Glock and shoot you right here? Go ahead, make my day. Give me a reason, right? Now, if he says, well, you can't do that. That's wrong for you and me. Oh, he's made my day, right? Because he's just indicated that morality is not relative, it's absolute. It's the same for me and him. And he says, well, I can't think of a reason. I just pull the trigger and I win the debate that way, right? Because you see, in a secular worldview, there's no basis for laws of logic. So, as far as I can tell, if the Bible were not true, you could win a debate by simply shooting your opponent. I wouldn't do that. I'm a Christian. But you see my point. The secularist can't explain why I can't win a debate by simply shooting him. Because in his worldview, morality is relative. I get to make up my own moral code, so does he. How do you decide right from wrong? Apart from the biblical God, morality can only be relative, but people can't live that way. When push comes to shove, they'll say, oh no, you can't just shoot me. That's wrong. Objectively. Oh, interesting. So you do believe in absolute morality in your heart of hearts. Some people might say, well, come on, Lisle, you don't need to be a Christian to know that. Everybody knows right from wrong. I'm going to say, then it should be very easy for you to give me a reason as to why there's a right and wrong. I mean, if it's so obvious, what is that reason? You're never going to answer that. There's not too many responses to this either. I'm going to give you 3 that I've heard, and most will be a variation of this, one of these 3. Some people have said, well, you don't need God to know good and bad. Good is what brings the most happiness to the most people. A lot of atheists hold to that standard. But then, of course, I'm going to ask, why? That's arbitrary, right? In your worldview, happiness is just a chemical reaction in the brain. Now, why am I morally obligated to try and achieve that particular chemical reaction in your brain? Right? Somebody else comes along and says, no, good is what brings the most pain to the most people. That's another chemical reaction in the brain. Now, who's to say that one is any better than the other? They're just arbitrary opinions, aren't they? There's no objective basis for this. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, we should be concerned about the happiness of others, or at least their well-being, right? And we should be in the Christian worldview, because people are made in the image of God. But in a chance universe, there's no basis for being concerned about other people. They're just chemical accidents. Why would you be concerned about the happiness of a chemical accident? You go out in your garage and there's a little spill of motor oil. You say, now, are you happy? I want to make sure you're happy. It's just chemistry, right? There's no basis for this. And even here, he's borrowing on the Christian worldview, isn't he? Because he's saying not to be concerned about others. You don't need the Bible, Dr. Lisle, to know good and bad. You just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I'm thinking, something like that. That's a Christian principle. Yes. I was debating a PhD neurologist. He's a brain expert. And I asked him about morality. He said, well, the moral code is simply electrochemical impulses in the brain, probably developed at some point in our evolution. I said, then why should I follow it? Why should I follow it? I've got electrochemical reactions in my stomach. Should I use my indigestion to tell me right from wrong? Right? If it's just chemistry, there's no obligation in chemistry. There's no moral obligation. Chemicals do what chemicals do. They don't have any choice in the matter. Somebody says, well, laws of morality are conventions adopted for the benefit of society. We need laws, Dr. Lisle, otherwise people go around acting like animals. I said, but in your worldview, isn't that what they are? Interesting. And by the way, who decides what benefits society? Oh, there's a problem, isn't it? Hitler had some ideas about that. I hope you wouldn't agree with him. So it's arbitrary. There's no reason why should I be concerned about society? If society is just a collection of people and people are chemical accidents, if I shouldn't be concerned about a single chemical accident, why should I be concerned about a collection of chemical accidents? It doesn't make any sense. Just to drill it home, consider an evolutionist who is outraged at seeing a violent murder on television. Now in the classroom, he teaches biology. He says people are just chemical accidents. We've just evolved from the slime over billions of years. There's no mind. There's no God. Then he comes home. He sees on the television that man shot that girl. That's terrible. He should go to jail. But why should he be angry? He's an evolutionist. In his view, murder is just one chemical accident getting rid of another chemical accident. Why would he be upset by that? That's an example of a behavioral inconsistency. His behavior shows that he doesn't really believe what he says in the classroom. Because the fact that he's angry that one person murdered another, and he should be, because that person's made in the image of God, shows that he does know that people are made in the image of God and therefore deserve respect, dignity, value. They have a right to life. Okay? But it wouldn't make sense. If you really believed in evolution in his heart of hearts, you'd say, oh, interesting, one chemical accident, you murdered another. There'd be no anger there. You don't get angry at chemistry for doing what chemistry does, right? You mix the vinegar and the baking soda, it'll fizz. You don't say, bad baking soda, you shouldn't have done that. That's wrong. Chemistry does what chemistry does. There's no right or wrong about it. And if we're just chemistry, we don't have choice, right? Now, obviously, our brain uses chemistry in some way that's a little bit mysterious to us, but nonetheless, we do have freedom of choice. And that makes sense in the Christian worldview because we know we're more than just chemistry. We have an immaterial aspect to this as well. We can make choices, and we can choose to obey God's law or disobey it. And when people disobey God's law, we ought to be rightly angry at that, because it's contrary to God's nature. We're just animals. The idea of crime and punishment makes no sense. None at all. Animals just do what animals do. The lion goes and kills another lion. You don't put the lion in jail and say, you better think about what you did. That was wrong. This is what animals do. They kill each other sometimes. If we're just animals, crime and punishment make no sense. Crime and punishment is a Christian conception. And boys, it's effective if you understand what's going on here. That all arguments against Christianity must stand on Christian principles in order to get started. And there is a very effective way of exposing the inconsistency in secular thinking. I call it the don't answer strategy. And it's based on something the Bible itself teaches. This strategy comes straight from Scripture, which is why it's so good. God does know how to argue. And in fact, he has yet to lose an argument. It's based on Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Now, Proverbs 26, 4 says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. And by the way, when the Bible uses the term fool, it's not engaging in name-calling. It's not just saying, well, you're a moron. It's using that term to describe someone, maybe someone who's very intelligent, but who refuses to use his brain in the way that God intended, and therefore has a very silly way of thinking, a foolish way of thinking. That's the fool, biblically. And so anyone who rejects God's word biblically is a fool, because they're not using their brain the way God intended, and they've been reduced to a silly worldview. So if somebody comes along and says, the Bible's not true, you don't want to answer that. You don't want to accept that standard, or you'll be like him. This is telling us we should not embrace the presuppositions of the unbeliever. Otherwise, we'll be just like it. So somebody comes along with a silly idea. He says, let's leave the Bible out of the discussion. We'll represent that with a silly outfit. Okay? Because that's a silly position. He says, I want to talk about origins, but you can't use the Bible. You want to talk about the origin of the universe, and you want to leave out the only record we have of the origin of the universe. That's ridiculous. That's a silly standard, isn't it? So we'll represent with a silly outfit. Now, if you agree to those terms, if you say, yeah, okay, sure, we can do that, then you become the fool, right? You'll be like him. You've embraced his ridiculous presuppositions. Now, again, I'm happy to talk science with somebody who says, let's talk about the science of origins. That's fine, but I'm not going to give up the Bible in doing that. Okay? I can bring in the science as well. That's fine. But I'm never going to embrace the presuppositions of the unbeliever, otherwise I'd be just like him. Now the next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly. You might say, oh, that's a contradiction. Well, it's not, because the sense is different. Lest he be wise in his own eyes. So on the one hand, we shouldn't answer the fool according to his folly in the sense of embracing his silly standard, his presuppositions. But on the other hand, we should temporarily stand on those presuppositions to show how silly they are so that he can't be wise in his own eyes. We do want to answer him according to his standard to show the absurdity of it so that he can't walk away thinking, well, I really won that debate. We want him to see the silliness of his own position. And it's kind of like, I'm not going to live in your house. I'm just going to step inside for a few minutes, destroy all the furniture, and then leave. Okay? And so that's what we're doing here. Somebody comes along and says, there are no absolutes. We can talk about religion and origins or whatever, but there's no absolutes. Well, that's a silly position, isn't it? I don't want to put on that outfit. I don't want to say, okay, I guess there's no absolutes, because that's a ridiculous position. But we do want to point out, now wait a minute, the statement there are no absolutes is an absolute statement. You see how silly you're being? We want to reflect back his philosophy to them so that you can see the absurdity of it. Okay, so we're not going to put on the outfit, but we are going to reflect it back to him and point out the absurdity of it. The statement you just made, sir, that there are no absolutes is an absolute statement. If it's true, it's false, therefore it's false. That's powerful. This is a very powerful strategy. Let me give you a silly example, then some more realistic ones. Somebody comes along and says, I don't believe in words. Words don't exist. Prove to me that creation is true, but you can't use words because I don't believe in words. And how many Christians would be tempted? We're always tempted to answer the fool according to his folly in the wrong way and become like him. We're saying, oh, okay, if you don't believe in words, I guess I can't use words. I'll have to use charades or something to show you that creation is true. No, don't embrace the presuppositions of the unbeliever. So first of all, the don't answer part. You're going to say something like this. I don't accept your beliefs that words don't exist. Okay, I reject your standard. Okay, that's the don't answer part. You're going to say that, or maybe it's implied. I mean, sometimes you don't have to actually say it. But you want to make it clear that you don't embrace the standard of the unbeliever, that you're not going to accept his terms for the debate, because then you'd be like him. Then you couldn't get anywhere because you couldn't say anything. Right? And then the answer part. But if words didn't exist, hypothetically, you couldn't argue anyway. You just use words to tell me you don't believe in words. The fact that you're able to make your case demonstrates that it's wrong. That's effective, isn't it? Hypothetically, if you were right, you couldn't have said what you just said because you used words to say it. Now what's he going to say? He's on the horns of a dilemma now. If he says nothing, then my point stands unrefuted. If he says anything, he proves my point that words exist. I'm winning that debate, aren't I? Yeah. You see how effective the strategy is? And by the way, if you want to see it masterfully employed, take a look at the way Jesus responded to his critics in his earthly ministry, because this is the strategy he used. He inspired it in the first place, you realize. Never put on the suit. Never actually embrace the presuppositions of the unbeliever. But do expose them for their absurdity by temporarily standing on them so that you can show the absurdity of it. Very effective. Some more examples. Somebody says, I believe in naturalism. Nature's all that there is. Everything's matter in motion. Show me logically how the earth could be 6,000 years old. Wait a minute. Naturalism, logic. Those are contradictory. If everything exists as matter in motion, you can't have laws of logic, because laws of logic are not made of atoms. They're abstract. No. So his question is contradictory. And I'm going to point that out. I'm not going to embrace his standard. I'm not going to embrace naturalism and then show him how the earth could be 6,000 years old from naturalism, because really it can't be if naturalism is true. So first of all, I don't accept your belief in naturalism. Again, you might not have to actually say it. It might be implied in what comes next, but sometimes it's good to say it. I don't accept your standard. I don't believe in naturalism. But hypothetically, if naturalism were true, it'd be impossible to prove anything because you can't have laws of logic in the naturalistic universe. Isn't that effective?
Yes.
That's a powerful strategy, folks. Somebody says, you can't take the Bible seriously, it's full of contradictions. Yeah, it'd be okay to say, well, show me some and I'll help you answer those. Okay, but don't continue going that way. At some point, you need to get to the don't answer strategy. And you point out, first of all, I don't accept your claim that the Bible has contradictions. In my worldview, the Bible is the Word of God. God doesn't deny himself. The Bible cannot have contradictions. Then you get to the answer part. And here's a question most people don't think to ask. It's powerful. Hypothetically, if the Bible did have contradictions, why in your worldview would that be wrong? Oh, well, everybody knows contradictions are wrong. I, as a Christian, know contradictions are wrong because they're contrary to the nature of God. God doesn't deny himself. All truth is in God, therefore contradictions can't be true. And how do you know that contradictions are always wrong? He's not going to be able to answer this. Well, I've never seen a true contradiction. I'll say, I've never seen Antarctica. Does that mean it doesn't exist? The only way you can know that contradictions are always wrong is if the Bible is true. Isn't that interesting? How about this one? It's wrong to teach creation in schools. Why, you're lying to children. Okay, do I embrace that standard? No. First of all, I don't accept your claim that teaching creation is lying. Creation is true. I'd be happy to talk about that, share some of the science behind it, share some of the, show you from the scriptures that it's true. But then hypothetically, if we were lying to children, why in your worldview would that be wrong? Because if children are just chemical accidents, why would it be wrong to lie to them? The criteria if it benefits my survival value, right? Well, everybody knows lying is wrong. I, as a Christian, know that lying is wrong. It's contrary to the nature of God. But in the chance universe, why not lie if it helps me survive? Right? In an evolutionary universe, it's all about the strong dominating over the weak. Why not lie if it benefits my survival? I'm very glad, sir or ma'am, that you believe lying is wrong, but that's a Christian conception. It's not compatible with evolution. Some people, you've heard critics say this, the Christian God's not good. He slaughters innocent children. Look at that in the Old Testament. You have the Israelites go out and wipe out. A lot of times even the women and the children, they just wipe them out, slaughter them. A lot of Christians have trouble answering that. But if you know the don't answer strategy, it's easy to answer this. First of all, I don't accept your standard when you say God is not good. Because God is good and is in fact the standard of goodness. To be good is to be in a way like God, to be consistent with his character. And so when you say God is not good, it's like saying Dr. Lisle is not very Dr. Lisle-ish. Well, that's ridiculous. I'm as Dr. Lisle-ish as I can be. Right? God is as good as he can be because he's God. That's what good means. And then the don't answer part, which is always the killer. But apart from God, how can you determine what is good and who are innocent? I just noticed you were using moral words. But morality doesn't make sense given your professed worldview in evolution. In your worldview, those children and women that you're so concerned about are just blobs of chemicals. With no mind, no purpose. They're just the result of chemistry acting over time. Why should you be concerned about that? And how do you make sense of words like good and innocent? Those make no sense given your worldview. Isn't that interesting? Recognize how the unbeliever must stand on the Christian worldview to argue against the Christian worldview. If you see that, wow, it's powerful. And you can agree with the Apostle Paul and say, where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? He certainly has. Key, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. See how everything depends on Christ, revolves on God, because God is the source of all knowledge. Then you'll be ready to give a defense and the answer to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that's in you, with meekness and fear, with gentleness and respect. Learn to disarm your opponent. And again, the person may or may not convert. That's not up to you. As Dr. Monson liked to put it, it's not our job to open people's hearts. That's up to the Holy Spirit. It's our job to close their mouths. And that's what this method does, and it does it effectively. And this is not a gimmick. It's not a way of winning debates. It's just a way of exposing people to the truth. Because we want them to be saved. And as you get better at this, you'll find you can refute any nonsense that dares to challenge the biblical God in any way. And as you get better and better at it, it's all the more important to remember the last part of that verse, meekness and fear, gentleness and respect. We need to answer the critics in a way that's dignified, because they do have dignity, having been made in the image of God, even though they deny it. They're still made in the image of God. And frankly, we've all been the fool at one point, so we need to remember that. God hadn't opened their eyes, we'd be in the same position that the critic is in. And sometimes I'll share that when I'm dealing with the critic. I'll say, hey, I was in the same boat you're in at one point. And if God hadn't opened my eyes, I'd still be in that boat. So I understand your confusion. It's not about bashing people over the head. It's about leading them gently to Christ, exposing the absurdity of their worldview for their own good. That's what it's all about. And we do that by standing on the Word of God in our every thought and every thinking. Again, the book that covers this topic in depth, The Ultimate Proof of Creation. I'd encourage you to get that. There are even examples in the back of the book in the appendices on how to use this method with folks. And this presentation also available on DVD, The Ultimate Proof of Creation. And then we'll follow up with nuclear strength apologetics next. This same method, by the way, is the method I used in understanding Genesis. Because people said, well, can you use this method with people who already are Christians, but they don't really believe the Bible, or at least not all of it. They think Genesis should be reinterpreted and so on. It'll work on them too. Just the specific questions you ask are going to be different. But the same method applies. Don't answer. Very effective. And again, the number of resources that go along with that, I won't go through all of them. But and don't forget about, as well, the introduction to logic, which is one of our brand new resources, and the teacher's guide that goes along with that. And in the next presentation, I'll talk about how logic is rooted in the mind of God. And again, you can get the discount packs. Have an instant creation library if you want. That's a great way to get these resources. Do sign up for our newsletter. And thank you very much. Maybe after the next one, we can do some Q&A, since I've been a little bit over on this one. So thank you very much. Yeah.